Hello, everyone. So another clip, another day, another 2 minutes of listening to Amir Tsarfati. Today we're gonna go over a 2 minute clip. I would have to admit that this is probably one of the grossest things I ever heard. But anyway, it's just my opinion. You don't have to think that way. So welcome, and let's just hear what Amir had to say. Thank you.
And then you shall know that I, the Lord, have spoken it and performed it, says the Lord. Now, the God is not just talking. My name is signed on the entire miraculous, unprecedented resurrection of this nation back to their land after 2,000 years. No one can take any glory. No one can take any credit. No one can take the responsibility. It's me. I brought them back. And if you have a problem with the return of the Jews back to their land, talk to him. And where do you think he brought them back to Israel from? Not from great experience around the world. Take a look at the things that they went through, which is, that's genocide. Let me tell you something about genocide. Genocide is when 80 years after you still are not back in the number of people that you were 80 years ago. That's genocide. In Gaza today, there are more people than there were from the beginning of the war. Did you know that? Yeah. That's not genocide. This is genocide. When the adults and the kids, when they are being massacred, concentration camps and mass executions everywhere, that's what God says, I am going to bring you up from. And that remnant will be brought back to their land.
Hello, everyone. So we've heard what Amir had to say. So let me just go over his clip. First, I'll start with sort of reference to the previous clip. In the previous clip, we discussed how Amir tortured Prophet Ezekiel, how he completely misinterpreted Prophet Ezekiel in chapter 37, where he said whatever was said in the chapter 37 was talking about Israel. So that's where Amir leads the faithful to believe that Israel was just brought from out of the grave ex nihilo, out of nothing, and God did it. So in other words, he not only twists the words of God as per the Hebrew Bible, he also inserts God where God did not perhaps do whatever Amir happens to believe that God did. So Amir, in this particular case, wants you to forget about the Zionist movement of 19th century. He wants you to forget about the Christian Zionist movement that supported the Zionist movement from the very beginning, even it predates it. He wants you to forget about the British Empire efforts to establish a Jewish homeland in the Palestinian territories, and wants you to forget about the Balfour Declaration. Forget about Zionist militias and their terrors and wars against the Arabs and the British. That started, of course, in the late 30s when British started having second thoughts about the Zionist projects they had supported. Let's forget about our arms shipments from post-war Czechoslovakia. Let's forget about the widespread UN support for the partition of Palestine in 1947. Let's forget all of that to claim that God did it. But God could not have done it because if you actually read Ezekiel 37, it cannot be described in the modern state of Israel. All right, so we're done with that bit. That's just the reference to the previous clip. Now, on the issue of genocide, Amir says the definition, he knows what genocide is, and the definition of genocide is about how the Jews suffered, which obviously they did. Holocaust was a terrible example of genocide. And he claims the population of the Jews have not been restored to this day from 1930s. And that's genocide. Now, I agree with that the Holocaust was a terrible genocide. However, one has to kind of think about it a little bit in a somewhat different terms. Because, first of all, uh, we'll have to look at the definition of genocide. Let's just look at it, okay? Because Amir says that's what genocide was. So, which I agree with, but it doesn't mean that other genocides that don't resemble that genocide cannot possibly take place, right? Okay, so let's read. This is the UN definition of genocide, okay? Genocide is the intent to destroy a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group in whole or in part through acts such as killing members, causing serious harm, deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about destruction, imposing measures to prevent birth, and forcibly transferring children. That's the definition of genocide, not the definition of genocide Amir provided. By the way, Amir's assertion that Jewish population have not been restored to the levels of 1930s is not quite correct. It's about roughly that what it was in 1930s. Now, I'm going to tell you a personal story to tell you how statistics of keeping the number of the Jews, to keep it tabs on the number of the Jews in the world, it's actually not as simple as one would think. I'll give you a personal story. In 1980s, when I was in the high school in the Soviet Union, everybody knew that I was a Jew. How did they know that? Well, there are a few markers, but one of them because I had papers that said so. In other words, in the European context primarily, the Jews were literally registered through governmental registries such as passport registries or birth certificates or whatever as such. Okay? So that's how people knew that. But now today, 40 years later, I'm in Canada. I don't follow Judaism. I don't go to synagogue. I don't register with any Jewish organization. And in Canada, nobody's asking you what your ethnicity is beyond white, indigenous, South Asian, something like that, right? Nobody's asking who your ethnicity is. So 40 years ago, I was a Jew, but today, by any count, I'm not a Jew. Okay? Now, I'll give you an example of my classmate. When she was in my class 40 years ago, nobody thought she was a Jew because none of the documents she had, presumably, said that she was a Jew. Okay? So nobody counted her as a Jew. But 40 years later, where does she live? In the blessed state of Israel. Okay? And she's counted as a Jew. So here's the story that encapsulates a personal story, but it encapsulates pretty well, in my opinion, what it means to keep the statistics of how many Jewish people actually live in the world. In the West, in the US, and in Canada, the only way for Jewish people to be actually counted as Jews that they have to be registered in the synagogue register or some sort of Jewish organization register. If people are secular, people don't go to religious institutions, don't register their marriages with them, there's no way to know. On any census, they simply say they're white or they're I don't know, they're maybe there's some census data might say the Middle Eastern or something like that. In other words, there's no specific register for the Jews. This is the complexity of Jewish statistics, so to speak, right? Okay, now back to genocide. Let's read again, just so sort of like it sinks in, because we might have forgotten since a couple of minutes ago what definition of genocide is. So let's read it. Genocide is intent to destroy a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group in the whole or in part through acts such as killing members, causing serious harms, deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about destruction, imposing measures to prevent birth, or forcibly transferring children. Okay? Now, I'll just give you one citation. There's probably hundreds of citations given directly by the Israeli leaders. Now, this one will be by Prime Minister Netanyahu, where he says quite overtly to the Knesset members, as reported by the Haaretz about 10 months ago. And the quote goes like this: "We're destroying more and more houses. So to make sure that they don't have any other option but leave." Okay? How is that for citation? How does that fit in the definition of genocide? Because it says deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about destruction, imposing measures to prevent birth, or forcibly transferring children. They're deliberately inflicting conditions. They're destroying all infrastructure in order to make the whole place unlivable. Well, in my view, that pretty well suits the definition of genocide, but you might disagree. Now, with respect to numbers, okay, so Amir said Genocide is when population has not been restored 80 years later. Okay, let's look at Rwanda genocide, all right? Rwanda genocide happened in 1994, just over 30 years ago. At the beginning of Rwanda genocide, now official story. I'm just gonna stick to the official story. I'm not gonna introduce any sort of left or right wing comments into this or any kind of bias. I'm just gonna say the that genocide is purported to have killed 800,000 people, out of which 600,000 people were allegedly Tutsis. Okay, Tutsi population of Rwanda at the beginning of genocide was million people. Okay, now 600,000 were killed. Okay, so the 400,000 survived. Guess what the population of Rwandan Tutsis is today, which is actually admittedly difficult to calculate because Rwanda officially abolished the ethnic definitions for their purposes of their record keeping. But okay, but we know roughly. Well, roughly there's between 1 and 2 million. So at the very least, they have restored completely in the 30 years, or they even doubled the population since the 30 years ago. So the question is this genocide or not? Is anybody arguing that Rwanda was genocide? I don't think any reasonable person would argue that Rwanda was genocide or not. Well, let's look at Bosnia, okay? Genocide in Bosnia and Srebrenica. Okay, what was the population of Bosniaks? That is to say, Muslim, Muslim minority or Muslim group in Bosnia and Herzegovina at the time of the civil war. The size of the population was around 1.5 million Muslims, that is Bosniaks. Okay, this is the group against which the Srebrenica genocide was perpetrated. Okay, how many people were killed in Srebrenica? By different assessments, in 6 and 8,000 people. That is to say that roughly 0.5% of Bosniaks were killed in Srebrenica. So the population has been restored quite a bit since then, and the proportion of people killed was very small, and yet it was a real genocide. So that is to the point that Amir knows what genocide is. Okay, let's go to the more even recent example. Let's go to Nagorno-Karabakh, which was the area ethnic Armenian enclave situated in the country of Azerbaijan. Okay, that whole enclave was completely 100% ethnically cleansed by Azerbaijan in the year 2023, where they drove the entire Armenian population of Nagorno out of Nagorno-Karabakh. Okay, now that particular case is still in courts. Chances are it will be ruled genocide, but the number of people killed was just literally a tiny proportion. The entire enterprise did not achieve killing all Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh, or even touch an Armenian population in Armenia, but simply driving them out of the enclave completely. That's called ethnic cleansing. And the guess would be that at some point in the future it would be ruled genocide. Okay, so whatever Amir's definition of genocide, this is all bunk. Okay, now the crescendo of Amir's genocidal denial, of course, is his claim that Gazan population have grown since the start of hostilities in October 2023. Now, it wasn't start of hostilities, but I would say it was start of genocide, okay? Now, my question to you, has there been census in Gaza since 2023? No, it has not been any census in Gaza. How does he know the population of Gaza has increased? Simple. He cites, now he doesn't cite it, but I know where he got the information from, because this information has been peddled by Zionist accounts for ad nauseum for the last year and a half for sure. Okay, he cites the CIA population projection report, so-called CIA population handbook, right? So what does the population handbook say? It makes a projection that Gazan population in 2024 is going to increase by 0.02%. Now, one has to pay attention to the words here. This is not a census. This is a projection. Now, the kicker is, when was the projection actually published? The projection was published in August 2023, 2 full months before the commencement of genocide. This people should tell any Christian or any person who listens to Amir Tsarfati that clearly they should not be listening to him. He's not only false teacher as theology is concerned. He's a verified liar and manipulator is not to be trusted. Anyway, so hopefully you enjoyed this segment. And if you didn't, you can dislike it too. That's fine. Leave a comment. But I bet those people who dislike it probably wouldn't leave a comment. But that's okay. Have a good day.